On this Divine Mercy Sunday, as always, we are given this passage from the Gospel of St. John. And it's very unfortunate because sometimes when you know someone's been given a nickname, it always sticks. I was called Dumbo because I had big ears. As a little kid, in fact, and I was also a very good swimmer, and people said, well, it's not fair because you use more than just your arms, you have your ears that help you swim, and that's why you're so fast. It's just jealousy, of course. But Doubting Thomas received a nickname that in many ways is not fair because he was not the only one who doubted in the resurrection of Jesus. And when he finally sees the resurrected Jesus standing before him, he professes the faith of the church. He says to Jesus, "My Lord and my God." And then Jesus will say to him, "Blessed are those who have not seen and will believe." Brothers and sisters, we know that the apostles, having seen the risen Lord, were completely transformed. But they had to, as Thomas did, stick their fingers into his side, see the nail marks in his hands. But Jesus tells his apostles that the future disciples will not be able to see him physically as they have. And he tells them that the ideal and the foundation of faith will not be to actually see the risen Lord, but for the future generations of apostles and disciples, they will have to come to faith in him without the mediation of the senses. They will not be able to see him physically. But there's something very important for us to understand. Jesus is not asking future disciples, that is, each one of us, to have what we would call a blind faith. This idea that somehow we don't need any evidence, we just believe blindly. One priest told me that a very pious woman in his parish once told him that her faith in the resurrection was so strong that even if they found the bones of Jesus, she would still believe. And that kind of dispels the resurrection if you find the bones of Jesus, and obviously the bones of Jesus will never be found. But the point is this: what we are asked to believe as Catholics is not a blind faith. It's not a faith that's not based on any fact. In fact, we have to say that the resurrection and our faith in the resurrection is not just a reasonable act of faith, it is the most reasonable position possible. That's what Jesus is saying. The faith of future generations will be based on the evidence of those who saw him. So Jesus is saying the best way to testify to the truth of the resurrection is to see how did it transform those who actually saw him resurrected. That's why Jesus tells us that faith in him as the Son of God, and this is the faith that allows us to triumph over the world, says St. John in today's second reading. Having faith in Jesus as the Son of God is possible in any place and at any time, but it is never a blind faith. It is always a faith built on the firm foundation of truth, of the fact that Jesus was indeed resurrected from the dead. And we know this because of the testimony of those who saw Jesus resurrected from the dead. Every last one of them was willing to give their lives. Now, no one gives their life for a lie. And the apostles, if anyone, knew whether the resurrection was true or not. No one would ever lay down their life for something they knew was absolutely a lie. And this is why, brothers and sisters, our faith in Jesus Christ, the Christian faith, is absolutely unique in this sense. No other religion has the same truth at its foundation as we have in the resurrection. Take, for example, the religion of the Mormons, Mormonism. Now, Mormons are very, very good people. They're very moral people. But I think we realize that their religion is not true. And how do we know that? Because at the very beginning, apparently there were 12 people, the 12 apostles of the Mormons, who apparently saw the angel appear, and they had the golden tablets, and they all 12 testified that they saw the tablets. But within years, many of them, because they disagreed with Joseph Smith, suddenly said, well, we didn't see the tablets really. They disavowed it. Some eventually came back into the fold, some remained outside, but the point is this: it's very clear that nothing supernatural took place there because these people were so willing to give up what they said they had seen. But the case of the apostles, is very different. Not one of the apostles who saw the risen Jesus went back on his word. Not one. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the resurrection for the apostles was not just a belief, it was not just this pious thought. The resurrection for them was a fact. They could actually see the risen Lord. They could touch and put their hands into his side. And this is why, brothers and sisters, we believe. We believe, and our faith is based on reason, it's based on logic, because we know for sure that only the fact of the resurrection could explain how the apostles were transformed. They went from being cowards when Jesus was crucified to, after his resurrection, going out. They were completely transformed. This is a fact. Even people who don't want to believe in the resurrection have to admit something happened. And something happened to St. Paul on the road to Damascus. He who was actually an avid persecutor of the Christian faith, what happens? On the road to Damascus, he encounters the risen Lord, and he is transformed. Something happened. No one can deny this. So how do you explain how these men who are unbelieving cowards 3 days later become the greatest witnesses the world has known about the resurrection of Jesus? And this reminds us that our faith, therefore, is not a blind faith. It is built upon the testimony of people who are willing to give their lives for what they knew was true. And this is not the case of any other religion. People may be willing to lay down their lives for an ideal. For example, a soldier, he doesn't believe his country will give him eternal life, but he lays down his life for good reason, to protect his family, for the freedom of his country. People can give their life for an ideal. But in the case of the apostles, they were not giving their life for simply some ideal. It was an all or nothing truth. Either Jesus was risen, and that's why they gave their lives, or he was not, and it would have been absurd for them to give their lives. That's why our faith is something that we can say is sure, because it's built upon something maybe we ourselves have not witnessed, but because of the strength of the witnesses, because of what they did and how they were changed, we can be sure that Jesus is indeed risen from the dead. Our faith is based on fact. It is never a blind faith. Please. I think today, unfortunately, many Christians are very afraid to speak about their faith because they are going to be called superstitious, unscientific, ignorant, easy believers. But what is the actual fact? The actual fact is that it takes more faith, and I would say more blind faith, to believe that Jesus was not risen than to believe that Jesus was risen. It's actually more scientific, more reasonable, and more logical to believe that Jesus is risen from the dead. And those who don't believe in it have to come up with these crazy ideas that the apostles had some kind of massive hallucination. That all these hundreds of people who saw the risen Lord, because St. Paul will say that even 500 people at one time saw the risen Lord. They all had a massive hallucination? No. So people have to come up with these crazy and preposterous ideas. Brothers and sisters, I think we're very aware of the fact that Jesus is risen from the dead. And there is very good reason to believe that Jesus is risen from the dead. And that's why our faith is not a blind faith. Now, one last point before I go into what I think really is the most important point for us, and that is that sometimes people say, well, you Christians have a blind faith because you cannot prove the resurrection scientifically. And I would dare any married man to say that to me and then say, well, sir, prove scientifically the love of your wife. Is there a scientific experiment for that? Why do you believe it then? You can't prove it scientifically. And there's other things that we know without scientific experiments. I guarantee you that if I put up a billboard in Harvard that on a certain Sunday of the year we would be giving out $100 bills, I guarantee you church attendance would increase. You don't need to be a scientist to know that. You simply have to know logic and human nature. So not everything we know can be known through scientific experimentation. This is important because today people say the only way to know things is through science. That's baloney. Why do we believe that Napoleon existed? Because of the evidence. Why do we believe Socrates existed? Because of the evidence. Why do we believe George Washington existed? Because of the evidence. Why do we believe Jesus Christ existed? Blind faith. No. Evidence. Fact. And this, brothers and sisters, is very important because I think sometimes we as Christians can be cowards. We're afraid to speak about the faith because we think it's sort of based on just pious beliefs. It is based on hard, concrete fact. But one last point, and this for me is perhaps the most important point of today's homily. I don't think people get up at 8 o'clock or at 7 o'clock in the morning on Sunday to come listen to Father Stephen babble on unless they really believe in the resurrection. It's obvious that all of us believe. But the point is this: what is the problem with our faith in the resurrection? We may believe on a very intellectual level, yes, it's pretty clear that Jesus must have risen from the dead. But the main point of faith is that it affect my life. Does my faith in the resurrection affect my life? Does it change the way I live? When I'm at home, when I'm with my family, when I'm with my wife, my husband, my kids, at my work, does my faith in Jesus Christ affect the way I speak and think and act? Because a faith that does not affect the way I live is not a saving faith. That's what St. James says. A faith without works, in other words, a faith that doesn't transform me through love, is a faith that will not save me. One of my favorite authors, her name is Flannery O'Connor, said something I think is so important. The truth, says Flannery O'Connor, does not change according to our ability to stomach it. The resurrection is a very uncomfortable truth, especially for Catholics. Why? Because if Jesus is truly risen, and he is, as St. Thomas says, Lord and God. And that means I cannot have in my life as a Catholic, as a believer, as a Christian, any other God, any other Lord. No other criteria can be above the teachings of Jesus Christ. But is that the case for every single Catholic? I don't judge, I just call it as it is. No. There are many Catholics out there who put things above Jesus Christ. For those Catholics, Jesus is not their Lord, he's not their God. And so there is something very uncomfortable about the faith in the resurrection. It's basically this, that if Jesus is truly risen from the dead, if he is indeed my Lord and my God, my life will be changed, not just for an hour on Sunday, it will be changed every single moment of my life. The way I speak, the way I think, the way I act, everything I do. And that's why the resurrection is also a very uncomfortable fact. Because when we look at our lives, we may think, there's still a way to go before I have a true faith in the resurrection of Jesus. The truth, as Flannery O'Connor said, does not change according to our ability to stomach it. There are many things about our faith that are very difficult, but it doesn't make it less true. There may be things I personally don't like about the faith or the teachings of Jesus that our world continually attacks. But it doesn't mean that it's no longer true. It is true absolutely if Jesus is risen from the dead. And this is why, brothers and sisters, I would invite us in closing to do only one thing in the next couple of weeks. Well, you can do many things, but at least apply what Father Stephen is asking you and inviting you to apply. Many times when people come to confession, they have a myriad of sins. We all have our sins. We all have our weaknesses. It seems like we kind of confess the same sins over and over again. And I think sometimes we can get very discouraged because it's like, oh, Father, I've got all these sins, all these downfalls. We can become very dispersed. I mean, I do this. In the next couple of weeks, of all the sins you have, of all the vices, of all the, if you want to say faults that you have, pick one and concentrate on overcoming that vice, that sin, with the grace of God. Thomas à Kempis, who wrote a beautiful book called The Imitation of Christ, said something I think is so profound and at the same time obvious, but then again, sometimes the most obvious things are the most profound. He says, if we were to overcome one vice a year, we would soon be perfect. Pick out that one thing that you're going to work on for the next couple of weeks. Not that you disregard everything else, but really work on that one thing. Root it out of your life. Maybe it's using bad language. Maybe it's using God's name in vain. Maybe it's looking at things on the internet that we should not be looking at, but we're just so accustomed to doing it. Pick out one thing. And then with Jesus say, Lord, I know you are risen from the dead. Help me. Make my faith in your resurrection stronger. Make it like Thomas, who fell at your feet and said, my Lord and my God. Make it like the apostles who are willing to give everything, because that's what faith asks of us. It asks everything to change, to be transformed. But look at the great beauty of the life of these apostles. Today we all have a faith in the resurrection thanks to how they lived their faith. Thanks to the fact that they were willing to give their lives for what they knew was true. And we too all know that our faith is absolutely true. We know that. But it's not enough for it to stay here. It has to change our life. It has to transform us. It has to change us. Because that is the faith, as St. John says in today's second reading. That is the faith in Jesus, the Son of God, who is truly God and truly Lord. That is the faith that will save us. That is the faith that will allow us with Jesus to conquer the world.
Heavenly Father, on this day that we celebrate